The clamor died down as midnight approached, though the echoes of suffering still lingered in the cold air. It was August 1570, deep within the massive walls of the Kremlin in Moscow. Outside, the city lay quiet, but inside the great throne hall, the stone floors glistened with something dark, something impossible to ignore. The marble was slick with blood. Ivan IV, known to his people as the Terrible, sat unmoving on his grand ebony throne. His chin rested on a jeweled hand, the hand of empire, the hand that commanded life and death. He surveyed the wreckage before him, a young Russian prince, stripped of dignity, stripped of humanity, laid bare in the shame of his undoing. That morning, the prince had entered the chamber with dignity, title, honor. Now he entered history as something broken, his identity undone. There was no mercy here. Execution would have been cruelty enough, but this was something far worse, far more deliberate. Ivan did not order a swift death. He ordered a spectacle. He understood that terror, humiliation, shame, they cut deeper than a blade. They destroyed not just a body, but the soul of a man, the lineage of a family, the very notion of honor that held a noble alive. Ambassadors sat boxed in at the side. Bishops and generals and their wives formed a semicircle of witnesses. They had been summoned. They could not leave. The prince had been stripped naked, not in private. Before them, before many, the carvings of holy saints above, the hush of high church, the solemnity of state, all juxtaposed to this moment of crafted public degradation. And then the blade came. The details were so extreme that even foreign ambassadors struggled to describe them. Some turned to Latin when they wrote it down, as if ordinary tongues could not bear the contamination of that horror. They recorded what they saw, the prince screaming for hours. The blade touching not just flesh, but symbol, identity, the core of his being. From his elevated throne, Ivan asked the wounded man in a voice cold and detached, "Now do you lack the strength to betray your sovereign?" The prince tried to answer, but pain and shame overpowered him. Ivan laughed, and when the prince could not speak, the next stage began. Impalement, public display. When it was over, the prince, naked, mutilated, bleeding, was pulled through Moscow's frozen streets. Commoners lined the route, staring upward, not fully able to speak, not yet fully safe. The march ended at Red Square. 3 hours later, the prince was dead, whether from blood loss or from the weight of his own shame. No one could say for sure. That night, in the stillness of his private chambers, Ivan discovered something powerful. He found that to humiliate a man's body and honor was to destroy him in a way death alone could not. He discovered that shame was a weapon more effective than armies. He discovered that when power unchecked meets human flesh, terror becomes theater. This was the beginning of a pattern, a continuity of cruelty that would echo across centuries and kingdoms, rulers realizing that the worst punishment was not death, but utter humiliation. Public spectacle, the collapse of identity. The screams in the Kremlin became whispers in future courts. The blood on the marble floor became a lesson in how absolute power can be turned inward on the defeated. When we look back at such moments, these monarchs who transformed suffering into performance, we are forced to remember that tyranny is most complete when it does not kill. Quietly but kills visibly, killing dignity, because the witness then becomes an accomplice. The nobleman watching, the commoners watching, everyone learns that no one is safe. So here begins the true story, buried in archives and reports and the cold chronicles of men who watched and could never unsee. The story of monarchs who weaponized violation, who turned human bodies into the stage for their terror, who invented punishment so disturbing that even their own brutal eras recoiled. And as you read this, ask yourself, when power is unchecked, what is possible becomes horrifyingly visible. Because once you know what they did in the shadows of their thrones, you cannot unknow it. The darkness that began in Moscow didn't end with Ivan. It metastasized through time and borders, a pattern repeated by rulers who realized one simple, chilling truth. Fear wasn't enough. Fear faded. But shame Shame lingered. Shame passed down through generations. And so Ivan built something more than a reputation. He built a method. After the death of his beloved wife Anastasia in 1560, likely poisoned by nobles, something shifted inside him. Or maybe it finally surfaced. The mask of reason dropped. What emerged was a ruler determined to not just destroy enemies, but erase their dignity first. That's when the Oprichnina was born. A secret state within a state, governed by terror. The Oprichniki were his personal death squad, 6,000 men dressed in black, riding black horses. Each man carried a severed dog's head strapped to his saddle to sniff out treason, and a broom to sweep it away. They were more than enforcers. They were performers in Ivan's national theater of cruelty. The Tsar didn't want assassins. He wanted a spectacle. Enter Heinrich von Staden, a German mercenary who served with the Oprichniki from 1564 to 1570. Years later, he fled Russia and wrote what he'd seen. His testimony was buried in archives for centuries because it was almost too horrific to believe. But it was true. Von Staden described a ritual, a formula almost, designed not just for execution, but for complete psychological destruction. The setting varied. Sometimes Red Square, sometimes the Kremlin's main hall, but the audience was always the same. The court, the people, the empire. No one could leave. No one could look away. The victim was dragged out and stripped, usually by force. Ivan, watching from his elevated platform, rarely blinked. He didn't issue death sentences. He issued performances. First came the jokes, the crude remarks, the mocking commentary, as though the act of torture was a social gathering. One noble screamed as his genitals were severed. Ivan chuckled and said, "Now he's got no balls to betray his Tsar." And the crowd, trapped between fear and obedience, laughed. But Ivan didn't laugh for entertainment. He laughed to assert control. His eyes scanned the crowd, waiting for anyone who didn't join in, anyone who winced. That was often enough to mark them as next. These were not quick deaths. He even made sure of that. The medical knowledge of the time meant victims could bleed for hours without dying. And that was the point. They didn't die in agony, they lived in it. Long enough for their families to see. Long enough for the rumors to spread. Long enough for the city to wake up every night, hearing screams carried by cold winds. Then came Novgorod. In January 1570, Ivan turned his wrath toward one of Russia's wealthiest cities. Novgorod was suspected, wrongly, most historians agree, of conspiring with Poland. The Tsar's response was absolute. A siege, a purge. A city brought to its knees by a master of fear. The Oprichniki surrounded it. No one escaped. Then began the performance. According to the Novgorod chronicles, Orthodox monks wrote of 5 straight weeks of horror. 5 weeks of cruelty, so calculated it could only be called a system. First the men, then the women, then the children. Ivan ordered the wives and daughters of traitors gathered in the central square. He had their fathers and husbands bound, forced to watch. Then the Oprichniki descended. Rape wasn't random, it was ritual. It was staged. It was repeated. The Tsar sat on a raised platform, watching it unfold, eating and drinking as if at a banquet. Sometimes he pointed to a family and said, "That one next." Estimates vary. But 2,000 to 15,000 died. Executions, starvation, freezing in the winter cold after their homes were destroyed. But the most persistent memory wasn't death. It was degradation. Survivors, few as they were, spoke not of violence, but of shame. Of how their daughters were taken before their eyes. Of how priests were made to bless the violence. Of how silence became a form of survival. Diplomatic letters from Hanseatic merchants, traders from the West, confirmed the stories. So did Polish envoys. So did Russian clergy. No one could ignore it. Ivan didn't try to hide it. That was the entire point. This wasn't justice. This wasn't revenge. This was domination. Through the body, through the soul. Ivan believed something terrifying, that if you break a man in public, he's never a threat again. That if you make him watch his family suffer and live with the shame, he'll never rise. He won't even look you in the eye. He'll teach his children to bow lower. He'll raise them to obey. By the time Ivan died in 1584, whether from mercury poisoning, illness, or assassination, Russia was a shadow of itself. Villages abandoned, nobility decimated, cities stained in memory. The Tsar left a nation soaked in fear, shaped by shame, and the world remembered. Because this method, it didn't die with Ivan, it evolved. History didn't forget Ivan's methods. In fact, it seemed to inspire others. As if his blueprint, humiliation as a tool of rule, was quietly passed across continents and centuries. One of the most disturbing inheritors of this legacy came not from the snowy courts of Russia, but from the marble palaces of ancient Rome. Rome, 37 AD. A new emperor takes the throne. His name, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history would know him by the name, whispered by soldiers with affection turned to horror, Caligula. Little boot, at first he was everything Rome hoped for. After the dark paranoia of Emperor Tiberius, Caligula's early reign felt like spring after a brutal winter. He reversed executions, gave out bonuses, reopened public games. But then he got sick, a fever that nearly killed him. And when he recovered, he wasn't the same. Some say the illness broke his mind. Others believe it simply revealed it. Whatever changed inside him, the outside world would soon witness something new in imperial cruelty. Not war, not conquest, not brute slaughter, but shame, carefully wielded, methodically delivered. Caligula discovered something Ivan had known centuries later. In societies built on honor, the most effective destruction comes not through the sword, but through shame. Roman culture revolved around dignitas, the deep, personal sacred sense of reputation and masculine control. A man's honor was inseparable from his ability to govern his household, especially the chastity of his wife. A man who could not protect his wife was no man at all in Roman eyes, so Caligula turned that exact pressure point into his favorite form of punishment. He would host formal Senate banquets, grand affairs full of nobility, pomp, and formality. The entire Roman Senate was expected to attend. These weren't gatherings, they were traps. During these meals, Caligula would stroll casually among his guests until he spotted a senator's wife who caught his eye. He would then gesture to her. Guards would take her away, usually to a room close enough that everyone, including her husband, could hear what happened next. The thin stone walls did little to hide the moans, the gasps, or the muffled screams. The senator was expected to sit still, eat, drink, and smile. To object meant death. To weep meant disgrace. To live through it meant humiliation so deep it hollowed the soul. When the emperor was finished, he would return with the woman, disheveled, sometimes shaking, and sit her beside her husband. Then came the commentary, loud, explicit, vulgar. Caligula would rate her performance in front of everyone, compare her to other senators' wives, laugh about her body, mock the husband's lack of control, and no one dared respond. Not even when tears welled in their eyes. Not even when senators visibly shook with rage. The historian Suetonius, who compiled the lives of the 12 Caesars, wrote in stunned disgust, "He spoke of their bodies as if describing cattle at market, and of their husbands he spoke as if they were gelded beasts." But Caligula didn't stop at violating women. He weaponized marriage itself. If a senator displeased him, by disagreeing with policy, by showing disloyalty, or sometimes simply by existing, Caligula might issue a decree, "Your daughter shall marry this man." The man in question could be an aging actor, a known abuser, a crippled criminal, anyone Caligula chose. And the noble family had no say. Their daughter's body became a sentence. Her wedding bed became a punishment. Cassius Dio, another Roman historian, recounts a moment when a senator's 16-year-old daughter was forced to marry an aging gladiator. Not only did Caligula attend the wedding night, he watched it. He even joked about it publicly the next day. The girl's father tried to object. He begged for mercy. Caligula had him flogged in the Senate chamber. And then came the breaking point. Valerius Catullus, a respected senator, stood during a session and finally spoke the words no one else dared. He called Caligula a disgrace to Rome, That moment, brief, righteous, furious, was answered with horror. Caligula didn't have Catullus executed. He had him raped. Right there, in front of the full Senate, a group of hand-picked gladiators dragged Catullus to the floor, and Caligula watched as the man's cries echoed through the marble halls. When it was over, Caligula looked down at the bleeding senator and asked, "Do you still object?" Catullus never spoke another word. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his villa. Suicide, they said. But by then, the Senate was already broken. Caligula's reign lasted only 4 years, but the scars ran deep. He was finally assassinated on January 24th, 41 AD, not by enemies, but by his own guards, men whose wives he had violated, whose daughters he had humiliated. They stabbed him 30 times in a palace tunnel. Then, with equal fury, they murdered his wife, smashed her skull against a wall, and did the same to his infant daughter. Later, one of his assassins was asked if he felt regret. The man simply said, "We became monsters to kill a monster." But Caligula's legacy didn't die in that tunnel. It spread like smoke through the palaces of England, the towers of Transylvania, the torture chambers of future tyrants. Because once a ruler learns that shame lasts longer than death, the stage is set for more. England, 1536. The heavy oak doors of the tower creaked open, and Anne Boleyn stepped inside, once queen, now prisoner. Outside, spring was blooming, but inside the walls, something colder grew, a performance of destruction carefully designed by King Henry VIII himself. Anne was not just to be executed. That would have been too simple, too clean. Henry, like Ivan and Caligula before him, had learned the deeper lesson: kill the dignity before you kill the body. He needed Anne gone. She had failed to give him a male heir, and worse, he had already set his eyes and desires on Jane Seymour. Divorce would have been messy. It would have undermined his authority. So Henry crafted a narrative, a spectacle of shame that would not only erase Anne, but obliterate her reputation so thoroughly that no one would ever speak her name with honor again. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested. The charges: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. From the beginning, the accusations reeked of invention. Dates didn't match. One alleged affair was said to have taken place when Anne was recovering from childbirth. Another when she was known to be confined due to illness. But none of that mattered. This was not about truth. This was about humiliation. The trial was held in full public view. Parliament men, clergy, nobles, all gathered, not just to witness a verdict, but to witness a slow public erasure. The court could have simply charged her with adultery. It would have sufficed. But instead, prosecutors read pornographic details of each supposed act. They described positions, sounds, places, what Anne allegedly said, what her brother supposedly did. Every word designed to shatter her as a woman, a queen, and a human being. She sat silent through it all, her face still, her hands trembling visibly only once, when they read her supposed incestuous encounter with George. It was a moment recorded by Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador to England. He wrote to Emperor Charles V, "I have seen many trials in many lands, but never have I seen one so determined not to seek justice, but to destroy a soul before taking a life." Anne's dignity was the real target. Henry didn't just want her gone, he wanted her remembered in disgrace. He wanted her family broken, her memory poisoned. Her daughter, Elizabeth, future queen, born under the shadow of her mother's manufactured shame. The 5 men accused alongside her were also executed, but quietly. No trials filled with sexual detail, no public humiliation, just the sword. It was Anne who had to be destroyed first in words, then in body, and when her day came, May 19th, she wore a red petticoat beneath her dress, the color of martyrs. She gave a final speech, composed and dignified, then knelt for the executioner. A French swordsman, flown in for the occasion. Henry, ever theatrical, chose a clean beheading, not out of mercy, but symbolism. Even in death, he controlled the aesthetic. But Anne's death wasn't the end of Henry's sexual warfare. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, barely 17, would suffer even worse. When rumors of her past emerged, rumors of relationships before Henry, she was arrested. This time, the courtrooms weren't just brutal. They were obscene. Catherine was forced to sit and listen as men 3 times her age read graphic descriptions of her body, her supposed lovers, her behavior. They read it aloud in Parliament. They summoned ambassadors. They made it state policy to discuss a teenage girl's sexual past in public chambers. No woman was safe. No dignity was too sacred. The Spanish Chronicle reports that the night before her execution, February 13, 1542, Catherine practiced laying her head on the block. She wanted to die well because she had already died of shame, and it didn't stop there. Henry weaponized marriage itself. When noble families displeased him, he would force their daughters to marry undesirable men, aging, cruel, diseased. Refusing meant treason, and treason meant the block. He even ordered noble widows to marry men they despised, knowing it would destroy their social position. These weren't unions, they were punishments. State-sponsored sexual humiliation, wrapped in the language of duty. By the time Henry died, in 1547, he was grotesquely bloated, covered in festering ulcers, possibly syphilitic. His body rotted as his court whispered of curses. But his cruelty outlived him, because Henry didn't just teach future kings how to rule. He taught them how to crush a person without ever drawing a blade, how to turn a courtroom into a torture chamber, how to kill a soul before the body. He needed Anne gone. She had failed to give him a male heir, and worse, he had already set his eyes and desires on Jane Seymour. Divorce would have been messy. It would have undermined his authority. So Henry crafted a narrative, a spectacle of shame that would not only erase Anne, but obliterate her reputation so thoroughly that no one would ever speak her name with honor again. On May the 2nd, Anne was arrested. The charges: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. From the beginning, the accusations reeked of invention. Dates didn't match. One alleged affair was said to have taken place when Anne was recovering from childbirth. Another when she was known to be confined due to illness. But none of that mattered. This was not about truth. This was about humiliation. The trial was held in full public view. Parliament men, clergy, nobles, all gathered not just to witness a verdict, but to witness a slow public erasure. The court could have simply charged her with adultery. It would have sufficed. But instead, prosecutors read pornographic details of each supposed act. They described positions, sounds, places, what Anne allegedly said, what her brother supposedly did. Every word designed to shatter her as a woman, a queen, and a human being. She sat silent through it all, her face still, her hands trembling visibly only once, when they read her supposed incestuous encounter with George. It was a moment recorded by Eustace Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador to England. He wrote to Emperor Charles V, "I have seen many trials in many lands, but never have I seen one so determined not to seek justice, but to destroy a soul before taking a life." Anne's dignity was the real target. Henry didn't just want her gone, he wanted her remembered in disgrace. He wanted her family broken, her memory poisoned. Her daughter, Elizabeth, future queen, born under the shadow of her mother's manufactured shame. The 5 men accused alongside her were also executed, but quietly. No trials filled with sexual detail, no public humiliation, just the sword. It was Anne who had to be destroyed first in words, then in body. And when her day came, May 19th, she wore a red petticoat beneath her dress, the color of martyrs. She gave a final speech, composed and dignified, then knelt for the executioner. A French swordsman, flown in for the occasion. Henry, ever theatrical, chose a clean beheading, not out of mercy but symbolism. Even in death, he controlled the aesthetic. But Anne's death wasn't the end of Henry's sexual warfare. Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, barely 17, would suffer even worse. When rumors of her past emerged, rumors of relationships before Henry, she was arrested. This time, the courtrooms weren't just brutal, they were obscene. Catherine was forced to sit and listen as men 3 times her age read graphic descriptions of her body, her supposed lovers, her behavior. They read it aloud in Parliament. They summoned ambassadors. They made it state policy to discuss a teenage girl's sexual past in public chambers. No woman was safe. No dignity was too sacred. The Spanish Chronicle reports that the night before her execution, February 13, 1542, Catherine practiced laying her head on the block. She wanted to die well because she had already died of shame, and it didn't stop there. Henry weaponized marriage itself. When noble families displeased him, he would force their daughters to marry undesirable men, aging, cruel, diseased. Refusing meant treason, and treason meant the block. He even ordered noble widows to marry men they despised, knowing it would destroy their social position. These weren't unions, they were punishments. State-sponsored sexual humiliation, wrapped in the language of duty. By the time Henry died in 1547, he was grotesquely bloated, covered in festering ulcers, possibly syphilitic. His body rotted as his court whispered of curses. But his cruelty outlived him, because Henry didn't just teach future kings how to rule. He taught them how to crush a person without ever drawing a blade, how to turn a courtroom into a torture chamber, how to kill a soul before the body, and like Ivan, like Caligula, he left behind a kingdom shaken, a daughter scarred, and a legacy of fear that history tried to bury. But someone else had already learned that lesson, someone darker. Someone crueler. The pattern reaches its darkest point, not in a courtroom or banquet hall, but on a battlefield of bodies, where cruelty wasn't the sideshow, it was the rule itself. And for that, history turns to a name whispered even now with dread, Vlad III of Wallachia. The world remembers him by another title, Vlad the Impaler. To understand why his name still bleeds through centuries of fear, you have to understand what made him different. Ivan humiliated. Caligula humiliated. Henry humiliated. Vlad combined humiliation with horror so absolute that death became a form of mercy. He ruled in 1459, perched between Ottoman expansion and European fear. Wallachia was small, vulnerable, caught between empires, but Vlad discovered what tyrants before and after him would perfect. If your enemies fear your cruelty more than they fear death, you do not need armies. He didn't just punish betrayal. He staged it. One of the earliest recorded events was a woman accused of adultery. Under Wallachian law, she could have been fined, shamed, or imprisoned. Vlad chose something else, something so pointed, so symbolic, that it reads like a message carved in flesh. He ordered a vertical impalement through the vagina, the stake forced upward, exiting through her chest. She was then raised in the town square, a warning, not a corpse. German pamphlets printed in the 1480s include woodcuts showing this exact method. The caption reads, "Thus Dracula punishes unfaithful wives." It wasn't just execution. It was a demonstration, punishment performed before the living. But Vlad didn't reserve sexual violation for women. Ottoman soldiers captured in war were castrated, their severed organs nailed to their foreheads before being impaled. To Vlad, the mutilation was not the prelude. It was the theater. Impalement was merely the grand finale. The Russian manuscript, The Tale of Dracula, even describes punishments where the wife was forced to eat the severed genitals of her adulterous husband, or be impaled herself. Historians debate that one detail, but its repetition across independent sources suggests it wasn't invention. It was testimony whispered in horror. Then came his masterpiece of terror, the year 1462. The place, Târgoviște, Wallachia. The audience, 90,000 Ottoman soldiers. Sultan Mehmed II, the same conqueror who took Constantinople, marched to crush Vlad with overwhelming force. But when his army approached the capital, they found it silent, and then they saw it. 1,000 bodies on stakes, arranged in concentric circles, stretching for miles, men, women, children, nobles, criminals, foreigners, the guilty, the innocent. It didn't matter. Vlad had turned the land itself into an open-air display of agony. The Ottoman chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondyles, who was there, wrote, "The Sultan's soldiers recoiled. The smell of death filled the air. The bodies were not merely impaled, they were posed in obscene ways, as if still mocked in death. Some were splayed, some mutilated, some displayed with their bodies arranged to imply humiliation beyond pain, humiliation meant to live on in the memory of the living." The Sultan, who had slaughtered thousands without blinking, hesitated. He turned back. Vlad didn't win through strength. He won through psychological devastation. He made the enemy imagine their own bodies on those stakes. He made them see their wives there, their honor there, their fear there. That was his power. It was the same method Ivan used. The same hunger Caligula wielded. The same poison Henry spread, shame first, death second. Legacy forever. But Vlad paid for it. They all did. By 1476, his own nobles turned against him. He was assassinated, likely by his own people. And in a final twist of cruelty, his head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to the Sultan, even in death. The humiliation returned to him, because rulers who build their power on spectacle eventually drown in it. And yet, this was only the medieval chapter. A darker truth waited still. Humanity did not stop this method. It refined it. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose and fell. Thrones changed hands and monarchies gave way to parliaments. But the method of shame, of using the human body as both battlefield and bulletin, remained. It crept into new institutions. No longer confined to palaces or war zones, it settled into courtrooms, where cruelty could wear a robe and speak in Latin, where the lash became a paragraph and the executioner wore a powdered wig. Even as civilization claimed progress, kings and rulers perfected the performance. They no longer needed fire or sword to destroy someone. Now all it took was language, public accusation, graphic retellings, sexual shame carved into the permanent record, and nowhere was this weaponized more ruthlessly than in the reign of King Henry VIII. But now the spotlight moved to his courtrooms, and the courtroom itself became the scaffold. We already saw what he did to Anne Boleyn. But she wasn't the only queen dragged through this brutal theatre. The next act would fall on a young girl named Catherine Howard. She was 17 years old when she became queen, barely a woman, still surrounded by courtiers, whispering politics and poison. Henry was 49, diseased, obese. His leg oozed pus constantly, his moods were volatile. But Catherine smiled, laughed, tried to play the part. Then came the rumors that she had been unchaste before marriage, that she had lovers, that her purity, the one thing a queen must carry in that time, was a lie. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The accusations were enough, but Henry had learned something from Anne Boleyn's trial. This time, he wouldn't just accuse her of treason. That was too clean. He would accuse her of filth. The trial began, and it quickly devolved into a state-sponsored degradation. Men 3 times Catherine's age stood before Parliament and read out what were essentially pornographic fictions, passed off as legal testimony. They described her body, her noises, her lover's alleged words, the rooms, the sheets, the acts. No evidence, just repetition and shame. She wasn't even there to defend herself. When she finally heard the charges, they were read to her aloud, word for word, in a formal hearing. She was forced to sit, a teenage girl, while elderly noblemen dissected her supposed sexual behavior like vultures picking a corpse. One of them, a courtier named Thomas Cranmer, wrote afterward, "She did not weep when condemned, she did not scream." But when they read the final details, her hands clenched so tightly her nails tore into her palms. She was held in the tower where a legend still haunts the stones. The night before her execution, she supposedly asked to practice placing her head on the block over and over. wanting to make sure she died with dignity, because her dignity had already been stolen. She was beheaded on February 13th, 1542. But Henry's reign of humiliation extended beyond his wives. He used forced marriage as punishment. If a noble family defied him, even slightly, he'd summon them and declare their daughters would be married to old men, crippled men, madmen, foreigners, enemies. The message was always clear. Your daughter's body now belongs to the crown. These weren't alliances. These were sentences. One noble widow was forced to marry a known wife-beater, another to a merchant, social suicide for a noblewoman. They had no right to refuse. Refusal meant treason, and treason meant death. He turned the institution of marriage, the cornerstone of lineage and family honor, into a tool of humiliation warfare. Even his own daughters weren't spared the shadow of his cruelty. Mary, declared illegitimate after her mother's disgrace. Elizabeth stained forever by the so-called whoredom of Anne Boleyn. Their births were rewritten, their mother's legacies twisted into lessons. Henry VIII died in 1547, bloated, covered in open sores, likely syphilitic. Servants reported the smell of his body before his soul had even left it. He had lost wives, friends, and allies. But his real legacy wasn't just religious reform or political maneuvering. It was this: that shame, when spoken from a throne, can echo longer than the sound of any blade. Because shame could be read aloud, filed in court records, etched into memory, taught as warning, and the world had learned it. But someone else, someone far older, far darker, had already reached the same conclusion. And where Henry used courts and marriage beds, this man used forests of bodies. In the cold shadow of Eastern Europe, before Ivan the Terrible ever ordered his first execution, before Henry VIII whispered his first accusation, there was already a blueprint of fear carved in flesh and displayed in forests. The man who made cruelty into currency, who mastered the art of psychological warfare centuries before the term even existed. Vlad III of Wallachia, remembered not as a prince, but as a warning. History calls him Vlad the Impaler. His reign wasn't just brutal, it was methodical. Every punishment was chosen not for justice, but for message. Every execution wasn't a sentence, it was a demonstration. He knew what Ivan would later perfect, that violence becomes immortal when people are forced to watch. The Ottomans feared him. His own people both worshipped and despised him, but no one forgot him. One story, retold in countless chronicles from German pamphlets to Balkan monks, describes a woman brought before Vlad. Her crime, adultery. In other kingdoms, this may have meant imprisonment, perhaps shaming. Not here. Vlad ordered a single stake to be prepared, a long, sharpened pole. He didn't speak, he didn't rage, he simply gestured. The woman was stripped naked, laid flat, and then the stake was slowly, cruelly inserted through her vagina, pushed upward until it emerged through her chest. Her body was lifted, impaled vertically, and left in the center of the town square, not just to die, but to be seen by husbands, by daughters, by passing merchants and priests. Public morality through private destruction. It wasn't an execution. It was a message. The caption on a 1488 German woodcut read, "Thus Dracula punishes unfaithful wives." But Vlad didn't reserve this horror for women. He had a philosophy. Let the punishment fit the crime. Let it scar the soul. When Ottoman soldiers were captured, he castrated them, but not in private. Their severed genitals were nailed to their foreheads, and they were paraded before being impaled. Naked, bleeding, mocked, not just physically mutilated, but symbolically unmade as men. A Russian monk, Ephrosin, who visited Wallachia and later wrote The Tale of Dracula, recounts a story where an adulterous man was castrated and his wife was ordered to eat his severed organ. When she refused, she too was impaled. The monk did not write in outrage, he wrote in awe. To Vlad, justice was theatre. Every act designed to ripple through generations. If one man was broken, his village would remember. If one woman screamed, the kingdom would whisper for years. And then came 1462. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who conquered Constantinople, marched into Wallachia with 90,000 troops. He expected resistance. He expected a fight. He did not expect the forest. As the army neared Târgoviște, the capital, they stopped. Before them stood 20,000 bodies on stakes. A forest, grown not from trees but from corpses, men, women, children, merchants, priests, foreigners. It didn't matter. The message was the same. You are not entering land, you are entering terror. The stakes were not just upright. Some bodies were arranged in grotesque poses, sexual, humiliating, degrading. Some had their heads twisted backward. Some had limbs nailed in unnatural ways. Some had been burned, others left to rot. It wasn't random violence. It was staged horror. The Ottoman chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondyles, who was present, wrote, "The Sultan, who had watched cities burn and empires fall, turned back. His men refused to enter. The smell, the silence, the spectacle. It was not war. It was madness, but it wasn't madness. It was strategy. Vlad didn't fight with armies, he fought with memory. He made his enemies imagine their own families on those stakes. He made entire armies flee without battle, not because of strength, because of the image of their own destruction. And yet for all his terror, his fall came not from invaders, but from within. By 1476, his own nobles had had enough. Some say they feared his wrath. Others say he had grown unstable. Whatever the reason, they betrayed him. He was assassinated, and in one final twist of poetic horror, his head was severed, preserved in honey, and sent as a gift to the very sultan he had once terrified. Even in death, he was made into a display, because the cycle never stops. Ivan, Caligula, Henry, Vlad. Different lands, different centuries, same truth. When rulers learn that shame outlasts death, cruelty becomes policy. They came from different empires. They wore different crowns. They spoke different tongues. But in the shadows of their thrones, they all arrived at the same monstrous realization that death is quick but shame lingers. That a man broken in public, a woman humiliated before her people, can carry wounds that echo louder than executions. But here's the truth. Most histories refuse to say aloud. These weren't random acts of madness. These were state policies. Each ruler refined the method, even built a bureaucracy of torture with his oprichniki. Caligula embedded humiliation into Senate protocol. Henry encoded sexual shame into legal proceedings. Vlad structured his punishments with mathematical cruelty. These weren't tyrants lashing out in rage. They were monarchs wielding humiliation as a calculated weapon of control. And it worked. For a time, because when a king castrates a noble in front of his peers or forces a wife to be violated before her husband's eyes, the room learns something. They learn to stay silent, to keep their heads bowed, to teach their children obedience. Not out of loyalty, out of terror. They learn that survival means compliance, even when compliance means letting your dignity rot. But history didn't let them win forever. Each of these monarchs, despite their control, despite their terror, fell. Ivan IV, the Tsar of calculated horror, died poisoned or possibly murdered by those closest to him. His death left a power vacuum that plunged Russia into the time of troubles. A period of chaos so violent that even Ivan's brutality looked organized by comparison. His dynasty collapsed. His children died or were murdered. The Russia he ruled with fear was left fractured. Depopulated and traumatized, Caligula, the emperor, who raped senators' wives and mocked them to their faces, was stabbed 30 times in a dark corridor beneath his palace. Not by rebels, not by invaders, but by his own guards, men whose families he had destroyed for amusement. After the assassination, those same guards smashed his wife's skull against the wall. Then, with equal fury, they killed his infant daughter. The man who laughed at screams died surrounded by them. Henry VIII, bloated and diseased, spent his final years isolated, paranoid and rotting, his leg ulcers stinking so badly that courtiers gagged in his presence. He watched his realm fracture over religion. He saw his wives executed or driven mad. He died surrounded by sycophants, not family. His daughters inherited a kingdom riddled with instability. Mary burnt Protestants at the stake. Elizabeth ruled with brilliance, but never escaped the shadow of her mother's death or her father's legacy of calculated cruelty. Vlad, the master of impalement, was betrayed by his own nobles. His head, his symbol of terror, was preserved in honey and sent to the same empire he once terrified. He died not as a feared prince, but as a cautionary tale. Because this is the truth no tyrant wants to admit. Humiliation can crush a people. But it also plants seeds, seeds of hate, of vengeance, of memory, and memory becomes rebellion. The victims of these rulers didn't vanish. Their names may have been buried, but their suffering echoed forward. Anne Boleyn's daughter became Elizabeth I, one of the most powerful monarchs in history. The families broken by Ivan's oprichniki later supported the rise of a new Romanov dynasty, one that eventually rejected the worst of his methods. The Roman Senate, that once sat in silence during Caligula's banquets, eventually became a body of open resistance. After his death, the empire tried, however briefly, to return to dignity, and Vlad became legend. A monster in folk tales, a warning in bedtime stories. Not a hero, not even a martyr. Just a name that made children hide under their sheets. Because the lesson all these monarchs missed was this: fear is not loyalty. Shame is not silence. Terror is not legacy. Eventually someone always remembers. Someone speaks. Someone resists, and the more grotesque the punishment, the deeper the hunger for justice. But this legacy of state cruelty didn't end with them. Their methods were inherited, repackaged, modernized. In the 20th century, entire regimes, fascist, communist, and democratic alike, learned how to turn human bodies into tools of control. Sexual humiliation became standard in prisons, in intelligence black sites, in military interrogations, in social punishments meant to silence dissent. Because while the tools changed, whips became cameras, gallows became microphones, the purpose remained: break the human before the body dies. Crush the dignity so the silence lasts longer. One chapter remains. One last lesson: the stakes are gone. The swords rusted, the palace is silent. But the method still breathes. In cold archive rooms and dusty court records, in testimonies whispered across time, we find the trail. Ivan's Kremlin soaked in screams, Caligula's banquets of shame, Henry's courtroom pornography, Vlad's forests of mutilated bodies. They built empires not just on conquest, but on the systematic violation of dignity. They understood something sickening and terrifying, that to strip a person of their sexual identity, their honor, their control over their own body, is to murder them without needing a grave. They discovered that execution ends suffering, but humiliation prolongs it. Death removes an enemy. Shame destroys a bloodline. For men, it was castration, forced observation, cuckoldry, the violent theft of their place as patriarch and protector. For women, it was public violation, forced marriage, public sexual commentary, stripping them of even the right to suffer privately. For children, it was forced witness, the inherited trauma passed silently between generations. These were not random tyrants in forgotten centuries. These were architects of terror, their cruelty calculated, intentional, and recorded in legal, religious, and political systems. They didn't act in secrecy. They ruled in the open because their true genius wasn't violence. It was justification. Ivan said he was protecting the state from treason. Caligula claimed divine authority. Henry disguised cruelty in legal robes. Vlad called it moral cleansing, always a reason, always a justification, always a script to sell terror as necessity, and it worked. Until it didn't, because every single one of them fell. Not despite their cruelty, but because of it. Their violence didn't secure their legacy. It corroded it. Their kingdoms didn't rise stronger. They splintered under the weight of fear. Their dynasties didn't flourish. They collapsed, cursed by the very shame they inflicted on others. But this history was buried. Too dark, too graphic, too uncomfortable for textbooks. You weren't supposed to learn about the nobleman castrated while diplomats watched, or the senator whose wife was raped behind a thin marble wall, or the queen forced to listen as men described her body like a whore's, or the woman raised on a stake by her vagina to set an example. You weren't supposed to hear these stories, because to hear them means asking one terrifying question: could it happen again? And here's the answer: yes, it already is. Not with crowns or thrones this time, but with uniforms, cameras, badges, algorithms. Humiliation has been digitized, streamed, weaponized through social systems. Governments leak sex tapes of dissidents. Prisoners are stripped and filmed for security. Courtrooms reveal rape victims' histories. News headlines mock the accused before trial. The stage has changed, but the show is the same. Power discovers what it can get away with. First it silences critics, then it invades bodies, then it calls the scream justice. But the worst part isn't the cruelty, it's the silence around it. How easily we forget the pattern, how quickly we erase the victims. That's why these stories matter, because if we don't remember that humiliation was once a weapon of empire, we won't see it being used now. If we don't learn that tyrants use shame more than steel, we won't recognize the moment modern rulers start doing the same. So remember, the marble floors of the Kremlin slick with blood, the Roman banquet where laughter covered a woman's screams, the courtroom where a queen heard lies spoken as law, the silent forest where 20,000 dead still whisper from their stakes. This is not just history. This is a warning carved in flesh and written in shame. A pattern that keeps repeating because we let it. A darkness that only grows when we flinch from the truth. But now you've heard the stories they tried to bury. You've walked through the shadows of kings who turned suffering into spectacle. And the next time power reaches for silence, you'll know where it leads. It leads here, to blood on marble, to heads on stakes, to screams no one dares remember until someone does. Now you do, and that changes everything.